Sir, you need to check in at the counter. The voice was a blade of polished steel, sharp and sterile. Kyle watched the old man shuffle through the glass doors, a gust of cold November air swirling in with him. Another one, he thought, his internal monologue a well-worn groove of condescension. Every Tuesday, like clockwork, the geriatric brigade comes to pop off a few rounds before their early bird dinner special. The range was Kyle's kingdom. It was a cathedral of modern firepower, all sleek black polymer, tactical gray soundproofing, and the crisp, digital glow of electronic target carriers. The air hummed with the quiet efficiency of a top-tier ventilation system, carrying away the scent of gunpowder almost as soon as it bloomed. It smelled of money and precision. The old man was an anomaly in this space. He wore a tweed jacket with leather patches at the elbows, worn soft and shiny with age. His trousers were gray flannel, and his shoes were scuffed but immaculately polished leather. He looked like he had wandered out of a history book and into a science fiction film. He carried a long, rectangular case, not the molded plastic Pelican cases the regulars used, but something made of wood, its corners rounded and softened by decades of handling. Kyle's arrogance was as polished as the chrome finish on the display case Desert Eagle he coveted. At 26, he was the senior range safety officer, a title he held with the self-importance of a four-star general. He saw the world in two neat categories, those who respected the rules, his rules, and those who were about to learn. Counter. Over here, Kyle repeated, a little louder this time, gesturing with an impatient flick of his wrist. His own uniform was so crisp it looked like it could cut glass, a tactical polo shirt with the range's logo stitched over his heart. The old man, who had been slowly taking in the vast, clean space, turned his head. His face was a road map of a life lived long and hard. Deep lines radiated from the corners of his pale blue eyes, and his skin had the papery thinness that comes only with great age. He moved with a slowness that Kyle instantly mistook for frailty, a deliberate, almost glacial crawl. He approached the counter, placing the wooden case upon it with a quiet, solid thud. The sound was rich and organic, a stark contrast to the synthetic clicks and clacks of the modern equipment around them. Just one lane, the old man's voice was low and raspy, like dry leaves skittering across pavement. Kyle tapped a rhythm on his tablet screen. Have you been here before? A long time ago. It was different then. Different, Kyle scoffed internally. It was probably a dirt mound with some tin cans. Before we turned it into a professional facility. All right, I'll need to see your firearm and your ammunition for inspection. It's a new policy, he said, emphasizing the word new as if it were a weapon. The old man offered no argument. He simply undid two tarnished brass latches on the case. The lid lifted with a faint sigh. Inside, nestled in faded red velvet, was a pistol. It was a Colt 1911. Not a modern reproduction, but an original, its blued finish worn to a soft, pewter gray along the sharp edges of the slide and frame. The wooden grips were dark with age and oil, checkered diamonds worn smooth in the shape of a hand. Kyle felt a smirk tug at his lips. A museum piece. He had seen them in books. He knew the design was over a century old. In his world of polymer frames, red dot sights, and custom trigger jobs, this was a dinosaur. Cute, Kyle said, the word dripping with disdain. He reached out to pick it up. The old man's hand, gnarled and spotted with age, moved with surprising speed, not to stop him, but to gently lift the pistol from its velvet bed himself. He held it with a familiarity that was almost reverent, his fingers knowing every line and curve. He worked the slide, the sound a smooth, mechanical whisper of perfectly mated steel. He handed it over, grip first. Ammunition, Kyle demanded, his eyes still on the ancient weapon. It felt heavy, solid. Obsolete. The old man produced a simple cardboard box of factory-loaded .45 ACP. Full metal jacket. Standard stuff. Kyle grunted, satisfied. Fine. Lane 4-inch. He slapped a laminated number on the counter. Hang this on your stall. Target retrieval is the green button. Emergency stop is the red button. Do not touch the red button unless it's a real emergency. Got it. The old man simply nodded, his pale eyes holding a deep, unnerving calm. He took the lane number, picked up his wooden case, and began his slow, deliberate walk toward the firing line. Kyle watched him go, a sense of smug superiority washing over him. This was going to be entertaining. He could already picture it, the old-timer fumbling with the controls, flinching at the recoil, barely managing to keep his shots on the paper. It was his duty, he told himself, to keep the range safe. And relics like that, in the hands of relics like him, were a liability. The old man, Arthur Miller, felt the familiar weight of the 1911 in his hand as he prepared his station. The cool, checkered wood of the grips was a comfort, a tactile memory that spanned more than 70 years. He ignored the stares. He could feel them, the curious and condescending glances from the younger shooters in the adjacent lanes. They were decked out in tactical vests, high-tech ear protection, and pants with a dozen pockets. They held firearms that looked more like futuristic movie props than pistols. Arthur's movements were unhurried. He hung the lane number on its hook. He clipped his paper target to the carrier, a standard bullseye silhouette. He pressed the green button, and the target began its whirring journey down the 50-foot range. He methodically loaded a single magazine, his fingers, though wrinkled, seating each of the 7 fat cartridges with practiced efficiency. The rhythmic click-click-click was a meditation. He slid the magazine into the well. It seated with a solid thunk. He worked the slide, chambering the first round. He took his stance. It was not the aggressive, forward-leaning Weaver or isosceles stance favored by modern shooters. It was an older, more classical bullseye stance, upright and balanced, a posture of stillness. From his glass-walled booth, Kyle watched, his arms crossed. He hit the switch for the public address system. A faint crackle, then his voice filled the room, artificially loud and clear. A reminder to all shooters to be mindful of your muzzle discipline and be sure of your target and what is beyond it. It was a standard announcement, but he directed it at lane 4. Arthur showed no sign of having heard. He raised the pistol, his left hand supporting his right wrist. The gun seemed to become an extension of his arm, as steady and unmoving as a granite statue. For a long moment, there was only silence from his lane. Then, the first shot. It was not the sharp, supersonic crack of a modern rifle round. It was a deep, throaty roar. A boom that felt more powerful, more substantial than the others. A single brass casing ejected in a graceful arc, landing with a faint tink on the concrete floor. Downrange, the paper target remained pristine. Not a mark. Not a hole. Nothing. In lane 5, a young man with a sleeve of tattoos and a custom Glock chuckled. In lane 3, another shooter lowered his weapon and shook his head with a pitying smile. Kyle's smirk widened into a grin. He had been right. The old man couldn't even hit the paper from 50 feet. It was pathetic. He keyed the microphone again. Lane 4, his voice dripped with mock concern. Lane 4, your target appears to be unharmed. Please try to keep your shots on the paper, sir. Paper is expensive. A few stifled laughs echoed down the firing line. The public humiliation had begun. Arthur did not react. His focus was absolute. His breathing was a slow, controlled rhythm. He let out a long, measured breath. Boom. The second shot. Again, the brass casing flew. Again, the target showed no new hole. Kyle was in his element now. This was more than just a job, it was a performance. He was the master of ceremonies in this theater of incompetence. Shooter in lane 4, perhaps you'd like me to bring the target into 25 feet. Or maybe 10. Kyle's voice was syrupy sweet, each word a carefully crafted insult. No shame in it. We all have to start somewhere. The laughter was louder this time. The other shooters were now openly watching the old men, their own practice forgotten. It was a spectacle. Arthur remained a statue of calm. He was an island of tranquility in a sea of rising mockery. He had lived through far worse than the jeers of children. He had heard the whistle of incoming artillery, the chatter of enemy machine guns, the screams of dying friends. The condescending voice over the loudspeaker was nothing. It was a gnat buzzing in a hurricane. He fired again. Boom. And again. Boom. 4 shots. 4 resounding roars that shook the air. And 4 apparent misses. The target, a perfect, untouched sheet of paper, swayed gently at the end of its track. This was too much for Kyle. This was not just incompetence, it was a safety hazard. What if one of those wild shots ricocheted? What if the old man was a danger to everyone else? His ego, now fully inflated, demanded he take direct action. He had to put a stop to this. For the safety of the range, of course. That was the official reason he would log. The real reason was a burning need to assert his dominance, to physically stand over this old man and prove his own superiority. He stepped out of his booth, his boots making authoritative thuds on the polished concrete floor. The air on the line was thick with the smell of burnt powder and the electric tang of tension. He marched down the line, past the smirking faces of the other shooters, and stopped directly behind Arthur. "All right, Grandpa, that's enough." Arthur finished his sequence. 3 more shots, each one a deafening roar, spaced by the same metronomic pause. Boom. 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 7 shots in total. A full magazine. With the last shot fired, the slide on the old 1911 locked back, the action open and safe. Only then did Arthur lower the weapon, his arm descending with the slow, steady grace of a crane. He turned, not with a start, but with a slow pivot, his pale eyes finding Kyle's. They were not angry. They were not defiant. They were simply empty. "Come. There's a problem, son?" Arthur asked, his voice still that dry whisper. "A problem?" Kyle laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You fired 7 rounds and haven't even hit the damn target. You're a danger to yourself and everyone else here. I'm calling it. Your time is done. Pack up your relic and get out." Arthur's gaze did not waver. "I am not finished." "Oh, you're finished," Kyle snarled, stepping closer, invading the old man's personal space. He gestured at the 1911, which Arthur still held, pointed safely at the floor. "Let me see that thing. It's probably not even safe to fire. The barrel is likely worn smooth." He reached for the pistol. It was a line crossed. A violation of the unwritten code of a shooter's personal space and equipment. Arthur's hand, the one not holding the pistol, moved. It was not fast, but it was inexorable. It came up and rested firmly, but gently, on Kyle's forearm. The touch was surprisingly strong. The old man's grip was like braided steel wire beneath the loose, wrinkled skin. "Do not touch my firearm," Arthur said. The words were quiet, but they held a weight that made the air grow heavy. It was not a request. It was a command from a place of deep and ancient authority. Kyle, shocked by the strength in the old man's grip, recoiled as if he had touched a live wire. Rage, hot and blinding, flooded him. Humiliated in front of his audience. "That's it. You're done," he shouted, his voice cracking. "You're trespassing. I'm confiscating this weapon as an unsafe firearm, and you are banned from this range. Permanently." He pointed a trembling finger at the pistol. His eyes fell on the grip, on a small, square piece of metal he hadn't noticed before. It was a brass plate, no bigger than a postage stamp, inlet into the dark wood. It was tarnished and dull, covered with tiny, almost illegible script. "What is this piece of junk, anyway?" Kyle sneered, reaching out again, this time to poke at the brass plate. As Kyle's finger touched the metal, a jolt went through Arthur. It was not electric. It was memory. The cold. The searing, bone-deep cold of a Korean winter. The smell of frozen mud and cordite. The gray sky over the Chosin Reservoir. The feel of the 1911 in his frostbitten hands, the metal so cold it felt like it was burning his skin. The shouts of men, the endless waves of white-clad soldiers pouring over the frozen hills. The image flashed behind his eyes, a sensory ghost that was more real than the brightly lit range around him. For a split second, he was 20 years old again, defending a broken bridge over a frozen river, the fate of his entire company resting on the 7 rounds in his magazine. The flashback was gone as quickly as it came, leaving behind only the echo of a profound sorrow. He looked at the furious young man before him, at the face contorted with petty rage, and he felt nothing but a vast, weary pity. "This is your last chance, old man," Kyle spat, his hand hovering over the radio on his belt. "Hand over the weapon, or I'll have security drag you out of here." This was the point of no return. The moment when his authority would be made absolute. Meanwhile, in Lane 6, a man named Sergeant David Chen, USMC, retired, had been watching the entire exchange with a growing sense of dread. Chen was 35, and he had done 2 tours as a scout sniper. He knew marksmanship. He knew what it looked like. And what he was seeing in Lane 4 did not compute. He had dismissed the first missed shot. The second made him curious. By the third, he was no longer watching his own target. He was watching the old man. He saw the stance, the perfect, unwavering posture. He saw the breath control, the slow exhale before each shot, a technique drilled into him at Quantico. He saw the trigger squeeze, so smooth the hammer's fall seemed like a surprise even to the pistol itself. He saw the recoil management, the way the old man's body absorbed the powerful kick of the .45, bringing the muzzle right back to the exact same point of aim, instantly. This was not a man who was missing the target. This was a man who was doing something else. Something impossible. Chen's eyes narrowed. He looked past the old man, downrange at the untouched paper. It made no sense. Unless. A wild, unbelievable thought began to form in his mind. A legend from his training days. A story they told recruits about the old masters of marksmanship. His gaze shifted to the pistol. The ancient 1911. And then he saw it. The small brass plate on the grip. It was a unit commendation plate, the kind they sometimes awarded for valor, affixed directly to a service weapon. They were rare. Almost mythical. Then he saw something else. On the old man's tweed jacket, almost hidden in the lapel, was a tiny pin. A small, pale blue hexagon, studded with stars. Chen's blood ran cold. He knew that pin. Every soldier, every Marine knew that pin. It was the highest award for valor the nation could bestow. The Medal of Honor. The pieces clicked into place with the force of a rifle bolt slamming home. The stance. The control. The old pistol. The impossible misses. The Medal of Honor. He knew who this was. He didn't know the name, but he knew the legend. They called him the Ghost of the Chosen, a Marine Corps marksman from the Korean War who had supposedly held off an entire company of enemy soldiers by himself at a critical choke point. The story said he was such a good shot, he could put an entire magazine into a single hole. It was a myth. A boot camp fairy tale. But here it was. Living and breathing in Lane 4. And this arrogant little mall cop was about to try and arrest him. Chen acted without thinking. He put his rifle down, turned his back to the commotion, and pulled out his phone, his fingers flying across the screen. He had one number in his contacts that he prayed he would never have to use. His old battalion commander, a man who was now a full colonel stationed at the nearby army base. The phone was answered on the second ring. Colonel Price. "Sir, it's Sergeant Chen," David said, his voice low and urgent. "Sorry to bother you, Colonel." "Chen. What's wrong?" The colonel's voice was instantly alert. He knew Chen was not one for social calls. "Sir, you're not going to believe this. I'm at the Northwood Civilian Range. There's an old man here. An old Marine, I think. He's wearing the medal." There was a pause on the other end. "Are you certain, Sergeant?" "Positive, sir." "And the range officer, some kid on a power trip, is trying to confiscate his weapon and have him arrested for missing his target." Another pause, longer this time. Chen could almost hear the gears turning in the colonel's mind. "What does he look like, Chen?" The old man. 80, maybe 90 years old. White hair. Blue eyes. Moves slow, but solid. He's shooting an old 1911. "Sir. I think it's him. I think it's the ghost." The intake of breath on the other end of the line was sharp and sudden. "Stay there, Chen. Do not engage. Do not interfere. Just keep the situation from escalating if you can without getting involved. I am on my way. ETA 5 minutes." The line went dead. Chen looked back over his shoulder. Kyle now had his hand on Arthur's arm, trying to physically pull the 1911 from his grasp. The old man wasn't fighting back, but he also wasn't yielding. He was an immovable object. "Give me the gun," Kyle yelled, his face red with exertion and fury. At that exact moment, the main doors to the range were thrown open with such force that they slammed against the walls, the sound echoing like a gunshot. All activity on the range ceased. Every head turned. Framed in the doorway was Colonel Marcus Price. He was in his full Class A uniform, the chest laden with ribbons, the silver eagle of his rank gleaming on his shoulders. He was flanked by two imposing military police officers in their own crisp uniforms, their hands resting on their holstered sidearms. Behind them, visible through the glass doors, was the front of a black staff car, its official flag mounted on the fender. The arrival was so sudden, so overwhelming, that it sucked the very air out of the room. The casual atmosphere of a civilian shooting range evaporated, replaced by the rigid, hierarchical reality of the United States military. Colonel Price's eyes scanned the room, his gaze like a laser beam. He took in the scene, the stunned shooters, the cowed employees behind the counter, and the confrontation at Lane 4. Kyle, still with his hand on the old man, froze. He stared at the colonel, his mouth agape. He had never seen a uniform that important outside of a movie. The colonel's eyes swept over Kyle, dismissing him in an instant as one might dismiss a piece of furniture. He walked past the sputtering range officer as if he were invisible, his polished black shoes clicking on the concrete with a sound that seemed to count down Kyle's entire career. He stopped directly in front of Arthur Miller. The room was utterly silent. The only sound was the hum of the ventilation system. Colonel Price looked at the old man, at his worn tweed jacket, at the ancient pistol in his hand, and at the quiet dignity in his tired eyes. The colonel's hard, professional face softened into an expression of profound and absolute reverence. He drew himself up to his full height, his back ramrod straight. He brought his right hand up in a salute so sharp, so precise, it seemed to vibrate with unspoken respect. "Mr. Miller," the colonel's voice was a low rumble of pure deference that filled the cavernous room. "It is an honor, sir." Arthur slowly, almost reluctantly, returned a nod. A flicker of something, recognition, perhaps weariness, passed through his pale eyes. Kyle stood frozen, his hand still hovering in the air where Arthur's arm had been. The world had just turned upside down. The colonel had saluted the old man. He had called him, sir. Colonel Price held his salute for a long moment before dropping his hand. He then turned to face the rest of the room, his expression once again becoming a mask of command. His eyes found Kyle. "You," the colonel said, his voice now cold and hard as granite. "You are the range officer." Kyle swallowed, his throat suddenly bone dry. "Why yes, Colonel. Senior Range Officer Kyle Jennings." "Senior Officer Jennings," the colonel repeated the title with a tone that turned it into an insult. "You were in the process of confiscating this man's property." He was a safety risk, sir." Kyle stammered, trying to regain some footing. 7 shots, and he didn't even hit the target paper. It's a clear violation of range policy." "Silence," the colonel commanded. The word was not loud, but it had the force of a physical blow. Kyle's mouth snapped shut. The colonel turned his gaze to the target carrier in lane 4. "Retrieve the target," he ordered. Kyle hesitated for a second, then scurried to the control panel, his hands trembling. He pressed the green button. The electronic carrier began its high-pitched whir, reeling the target back toward the firing line. As it approached, the crowd of onlookers craned their necks. They saw what they expected to see, a clean sheet of paper. No holes. No marks. Kyle's face showed a flicker of vindication. "See. I was right." The target arrived and stopped. Kyle unclipped it from the carrier with fumbling fingers. "Hold it up," the colonel ordered. Kyle held the paper target up for all to see. It was pristine. "Do you know who this is?" the colonel asked the room at large, his voice resonating with historical weight. He gestured toward Arthur, who stood silently, a figure of quiet patience. No one answered. "This is Chief Warrant Officer Arthur Miller, United States Marine Corps, retired," the colonel announced. But his men, the few who survived, they knew him by another name. They called him, the Ghost of the Chosen. A murmur went through the crowd. The name, the legend, was known to some. Sergeant Chen, standing by his lane, nodded slowly, his suspicions confirmed. In the winter of 1950, The colonel's voice took on the cadence of a citation. During the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir, then Sergeant Miller's rifle company was tasked with holding a strategic bridge against an entire division of the Chinese People's Volunteer Army. They were outnumbered 20-1. They were low on ammunition, without air support, and were freezing to death in temperatures that dropped to 40 below 0 inch. The colonel took a step closer to Arthur. When the main enemy assault came, the line broke. A full retreat was ordered. But the retreat path was across that bridge. If it fell, the entire regiment would be cut off and annihilated. Sergeant Miller, armed with nothing but his service pistol, this pistol, he pointed to the 1911 in Arthur's hand, and 2 extra magazines, disobeyed the order to retreat. He single-handedly held the narrow approach to that bridge for over an hour, buying the time his company needed to get across. The range was as quiet as a tomb. The shooters, men who thought themselves tough in their modern gear, looked at the frail old man in the tweed jacket with a new, dawning sense of awe. The official report states he neutralized over 50 enemy combatants from a distance of 50 feet. With a .45 pistol. In a blizzard. With hands so frostbitten he could barely feel the trigger. For this action, he was awarded the Medal of Honor. The colonel paused, letting the weight of his words settle. And as for his shooting today, he turned his piercing gaze back to Kyle. As for his missing the target, you are a fool. He strode over to Kyle and took the paper target from his trembling hands. He held it up high. Your eyes are good for seeing rules, but they are blind to greatness, the colonel said, his voice ringing with contempt. He pointed to the very center of the bullseye. There, in the absolute heart of the black circle, was a single hole. It was not a clean, round puncture. It was slightly ragged, a little wider than a .45 caliber round ought to be. The colonel addressed the crowd. Chief Warrant Officer Miller did not miss the target. He fired 7 rounds. The first shot made this hole. The next 6 shots went through the exact same hole. A collective gasp swept through the room. It was an impossible feat, a myth made real. To put 7 rounds of a heavy recoiling .45 pistol through the same hole from 50 feet away was a level of marksmanship that bordered on the supernatural. The ragged edges of the single hole were the only evidence that more than one bullet had passed through it. The colonel lowered the target and fixed Kyle with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. You stand here in your clean, safe, temperature-controlled facility, and you presume to judge a man who has forgotten more about marksmanship, courage, and duty than you will ever know. You saw an old man with an old gun, and you saw weakness. You saw an opportunity to flex your pathetic little authority. You did not see the hero standing right in front of you. You failed as a range officer, you failed as a citizen, and you have disgraced this establishment. Kyle's face had gone from red to a pasty, sickly white. His entire world had crumbled in the space of 5 minutes. He was not an authority figure. He was a clown. A footnote in a legend story. He looked at Arthur Miller, at the men he had ridiculed and tried to eject, and for the first time, he saw him. He saw the weight of history in his posture, the ghosts of battles in his quiet eyes. The colonel's rebuke was not finished. Your job is to ensure safety. It is not to humiliate patrons. It is not to enforce rules with a blind and arrogant ignorance. Respect is not in your rule book, but it is the first rule of being a decent human being. A lesson you have failed spectacularly to learn. He turned away from Kyle in dismissal. He then looked at Arthur, his expression softening once more. It was then that Arthur Miller finally spoke, his voice cutting through the thick silence. Colonel. The colonel turned back to him, instantly attentive. The boy was just doing his job, Arthur said, his voice quiet but clear. The rules are the rules. He is young. He sees what is in front of him, not what came before. He looked at Kyle, a hint of something that was not anger, but a profound sadness, in his eyes. Don't be too hard on him. He has learned his lesson today. The grace of the gesture was more damning than the colonel's anger had ever been. To be defended by the men you have just publicly humiliated was the ultimate rebuke. Colonel Price looked at Arthur, then back at the shattered young man. He gave a slow, reluctant nod. The fallout was immediate. Kyle was not fired, a direct result of Arthur's quiet intervention with the range owner later that day. But he was stripped of his title as Senior Range Safety Officer. He was reassigned to the basement, tasked with sorting and cleaning spent brass casings, a solitary, humbling job. His reign over the firing line was over. The range owner, a shrewd businessman terrified of the bad press and the shame, instituted a new mandatory training program for all his staff. It was a course in veteran etiquette and history, designed to prevent such an incident from ever happening again. They called it the Miller Protocol. Weeks turned into months. Winter thawed into a cool spring. Kyle was a different person. The arrogance had been sandblasted away, leaving behind a quiet, hollowed-out humility. He did his work in the basement, the rhythmic clinking of brass a constant reminder of his failure. One Saturday morning, on his day off, he was in a small coffee shop downtown. As he waited for his order, the door opened and a familiar figure walked in. It was Arthur Miller. Kyle's heart hammered in his chest. His first instinct was to turn and flee, to hide his face in shame. He couldn't bear to look the old man in the eye. But he didn't run. He stood his ground. He watched as the old hero made his slow, deliberate way to the counter. Then, Kyle did something he wouldn't have been capable of 6 months prior. He stepped forward. "I've got his," he said to the barista, placing a $10 bill on the counter. "Whatever he's having." He then turned and faced Arthur Miller. The old man looked at him, his pale blue eyes holding no malice, no judgment. Only a quiet, waiting calm. Kyle couldn't find the words for an apology. They all felt cheap and inadequate. So he just said the only two that mattered. "Thank you, sir." Arthur Miller looked at the humbled young man for a long moment. He saw the shame, but he also saw the change. He saw the beginning of wisdom born from a painful lesson. He gave a slow, single nod. A gesture of acceptance. Of forgiveness. Then he turned, picked up the coffee Kyle had bought for him, and walked to a small table by the window, leaving Kyle standing there, finally, and completely, disarmed. True strength does not need to announce itself with noise and bluster. It resides in quiet dignity, in actions that speak louder than any words. It is forged in crucibles we can barely imagine, and it carries a weight that deserves not our judgment, but our deepest, most profound respect.